This video is sponsored by Domestika. Hi everyone and welcome to another photo manipulation tutorial on my channel. Now this is the first video I publish after hitting the 100k subscriber milestone. So once again, thank you so much for your amazing support. I'm so excited to see this many people enjoy and find value in my content. I have so many exciting projects coming up, so if you're not subscribed, make sure you hit those buttons to stay updated. And now let's get into the video. Keep in mind that if you wish to learn more about the file structure and have a closer look at my process, you can find the final PSD file for this project as well as many others from past videos on my Patreon page, so I'll link that in the description below. So first of all, let's open Photoshop and start by creating a new document, and you can set the resolution to whichever you want, but remember, the higher resolution, the more resources you're gonna need. So since I'm recording this, I'm just gonna go with something medium in size. Usually I go with 2000 by 2500, which is also a perfect ratio for Instagram. We can start by importing the first image of this field, which I got from unsplash.com. Let's resize this, make it a bit larger. I will just reposition it somewhere here and then hit confirm. Let's give that a descriptive name, and you can do that by double clicking on the layer's name and change it to field. I want to get rid of the sky here since I'm going to replace it with a different image. So let's go to the quick selection tool. What I'm going to do here is start painting on the field itself to quickly select this area. If you do go beyond your desired selection, you can press and hold Alt, and now you can use the brush to remove that selection like this. Cool, we can refine it later, but for now you can go ahead and click on this icon right here to add a layer mask based on the selection, and this guy is gone. As you can see, there is a bit of it that was left out. We can switch over to the brush tool, make sure the foreground color is set to black, mask is selected, and you can simply use the brush to get rid of any remaining pixels, just like that. Before we move on to the next step, let me introduce you guys to today's sponsor. Domestika is currently the fastest growing creative online community where the best creative experts share their knowledge and skills through professionally produced courses. What makes Domestika unique and truly stand out from other educational platforms is its focus on creatives. Today, the platform is home to over 5 million people from around the world who are passionate about learning new creative skills such as illustration, drawing, and painting, to an extensive variety of design courses including graphic design, 2D and 3D design, and much more. You will also find courses that will help you make a living as a creative, so you can learn how to build your YouTube channel from scratch, manage your finances, and even sell your digital products online. And while the quality of courses on other platforms can vary wildly, all of the courses on Domestika are high quality since the filming and production are handled by in-house professionals. There's no membership fee or subscription to start on Domestika. You just pay for the course you want and learn at your own pace. The price per course is very accessible with regular discounts available. Another huge advantage is that each course includes a signed certificate that you can download and add to your portfolio. There's also plenty of free tutorials, resources, and interviews on their blog worth checking out. So if you want to start polishing your skills and build your portfolio, Domestika is the right platform. I've used it myself in the past, and I'm sure you guys are gonna love it too. And to help you get started, I've partnered with Domestika, and we're sharing a special 10% discount code that you can use on top of any offer that's already available on the website. And you'll find the link in the description below. So now let's get back to Photoshop. Now let's move on to the second image. I want to add some mountains in the horizon here. The scale is perfect, so let's hit confirm and move it below the field layer. I think it's better to reposition it here, and to blend both images a bit better, let's go back to the fields mask, select it, make sure the foreground color is set to black, and we can use a feathered brush to kind of erase some of this area right here, just to feather the edges and make these two images look like a single one. Now we still need to fill this blank area here, so maybe let's add a new sky image, resize it to fill the whole document, and let's move this layer below the mountains. Maybe I'll slide this a bit higher, just somewhere around here. Let's go back to the mountains, add a layer mask, select the brush tool again, and we can start erasing at the very top here to blend the edges. If you want to feather it even more, you can bring the brush opacity down and readjust the feather for a seamless blend. Alright, that looks good, except that the colors and brightness of both skies still doesn't match. So let's go back to the sky layer that we just imported. Let's rename it, add an exposure layer right above it, right click and create a clipping mask to make sure it only affects the layer that comes directly below it. Let's bump up the exposure. Maybe I'll bring the offset a bit lower. You can adjust the gamma as well. Cool. The exposure is fine right now, but the color is still off. So let's add a hue and saturation layer. Again, same thing, right click and create a clipping mask. Then you can adjust the hue until the color matches the mountain sky. I still want to add a surreal feel to the scene, so let's bring in this Milky Way image to the top right here. Confirm, rename this, add a layer mask and use the brush to blend this with the sky that's right below it. I know this probably isn't 100% realistic or logical, but it all depends on the look you imagine. I really like this kind of vibe, so I'm just gonna go with it. Now that we have the background set for the artwork, let's go and work on the other elements. And I'm going to start by bringing the earth image in, and let's rotate it towards the right, something like this. And obviously we want to mask out the dark space around the earth. We're going to use a different approach here, so all you need to do is go to select, subject, and Photoshop will automatically draw. Okay, that obviously didn't go according to my plan, so let's press Ctrl D to remove the selection, and maybe this time let's change over to the elliptical tool and just manually draw a mask around the earth right here. Don't worry if it's larger or smaller, you can always readjust your masking even after applying. Click on add layer mask, and there you go. Just like that, the sky is gone. And I think my selection is pretty good as it is, so I'm not going to waste any time trying to perfect the edges here. But remember, you can do that on your side using the brush tool if you need to. Apart from that, maybe I'll move it a bit lower to have some contact with the ground. Nice. I plan to add a bunch of elements and adjustment layers on top of this, so to keep things organized, let's go ahead and add this layer to a new folder. Let's call this Earth folder, and you can simply drag any layer to move it inside. As usual, the first thing I do after adding any new element is trying to match its color to the rest of the scene. So let's go to adjustments and click on hue saturation layer, create a clipping mask, and simply play with the adjustments here until the color matches your existing images. So this is before and this is after. Perfect. Next, let's add a new exposure layer, create a clipping mask, and I want to bring the exposure down, something like that. Perhaps I'll adjust the gamma and change it to 1.3 or so. Let's bring the offset up a bit. That looks pretty good. Now I want this exposure effect to apply on the top half of the earth only, since there's more light coming from the sky over here, and the bottom half is supposed to be darker since it's sitting between mountains. So with the adjustment layers mask selected, start painting at the bottom half here to remove the exposure adjustment. I do want to darken the bottom even more, so let's go ahead and add another exposure layer, add clipping mask, and this time bring the exposure down even more. Let's also adjust the gamma a bit. Cool. Now again, we can just erase some of the exposure effect that we just added here at the top. You can see clearly from the mountains here that there's more light coming from the left side, so you can replicate that on other elements. Make sure that the left side of your earth is brighter, and if you want to bring back more darkness right here, you can simply press X to switch the foreground color back to white and start painting around this area. I'm quite happy with the exposure here. I'm thinking of adding a bit of yellowish tint towards the bottom on the sides of the earth, just to match the entire look of the scene. So let's go ahead and add a new saturation adjustment, create a clipping mask. This time let's enable colorize. I'll make it a bit darker, bring the saturation up towards 50 or so, and then we can change the hue to something like this, which is pretty close to the colors of the field and mountains right here. This time with the mask selected, let's press on Ctrl I to invert the mask, and we can use the brush to kind of repaint around the edges right here. You don't have to go too crazy with this, so let's maybe reduce the opacity of the layer a bit down to like 70% or so. That looks really good. Another important part of making sure that everything blends in together and look more natural is using shadows. So let's go ahead and work on that. Select the mountains layer, back to the adjustment panel, create exposure layer, create a clipping mask. Let's reduce the exposure. Maybe I'll change the gamma to 0.7. Now again, just like what we did earlier, press Ctrl I to invert the mask, and using the brush tool, let's paint over this area of contact between the earth and the mountains to create some shadows. It looks like I went beyond the mountains there in the sky, which doesn't make any sense. So simply press X to switch back to the eraser mode and remove the shadows from this area. Let's do that on the field as well, since I don't imagine the shadows casting all the way over here. Awesome, that looks good. The earth now looks bigger. It's clearly not just an image that was pasted there. It actually has some weight to it now. But I still want to make it look even cooler. I'm gonna do that by adding some clouds around the earth. I have the right graphic for that. We can simply use the eraser tool to keep one cloud element only. Let's rename this to cloud 1 and reduce the opacity a bit. You can always duplicate this by pressing Ctrl J, move the second layer to a different spot. You can change the scale as well, or the rotation, to make it look like a completely different cloud. Let's place it right here. That looks good. You can play around with that and add as many elements as you want. Maybe you want to add like a rocket ship, airplane, or a hot air balloon. The sky is the limit. In my case, I'm just going to add one more thing here, and it's this PNG image of birds. I know the scale doesn't make any sense. Birds are not that big compared to the earth, but again, we just placed the whole planet on the ground, guys, so this is entirely up to your imagination and doesn't necessarily have to make any sense. Also, remember that elements at this distance are supposed to look a bit more faded and have less contrast. So let's go ahead and add levels, create a clipping mask, bring the midtones a bit up. I guess that did not work, so let's try bringing the input value up. There you go. And yes, of course, we're gonna apply a similar effect on the earth as well. But before that, let's focus on making the earth look even cooler. And if there's anything that makes things cool in Photoshop, it's glow. So let's go back to the earth folder, create a hue saturation layer, enable colorize, change the hue to blue. Let's bring the saturation up and make sure the blue tone is right. Change the blend mode to screen. Now let's select the mask and press Ctrl I to invert. Let's take the brush tool, scale it up, make sure your foreground color is set to white, and simply press once to create glow all around the earth. You can press again since we're at 50% opacity to make that even more intense. If you think it's too much, you can always play with the opacity of your layer or simply adjust the hue and saturation properties. Awesome, now as I mentioned earlier, I want to add a bit of atmosphere right in front of the earth to create that sense of distance. So let's go ahead and create a new layer. I'm gonna call this fog, change the color to light gray. I also want to change the brush shape to something with rough edges. For this particular effect, I already have the perfect brush for it, and it's this fog brush from VisualforJulius, which I always use, and I will leave a link to that down in the description below. And I'm just gonna randomly paint around this area here. The fog makes it seem like the earth is really far away in distance. Let's check that out. Before, after, perfect. I'm really happy with this look. I think at this point we're done with the earth adjustments and we can move on to compositing the remaining elements. Let's go ahead and focus on creating the concrete in the foreground right here, and I have the perfect image for that. Let's scale it up. Maybe I'll also rotate it slightly towards the left to match the perspective. Now obviously we're going to mask everything out, leaving just a piece of the concrete on the bottom right here. So let's switch over to the pen tool and draw a selection. Once done, simply click on mask, and the cool thing about the pen tool is that you can easily adjust your mask if you want to. As usual, the first thing you want to do is match the brightness. So let's add a brightness adjustment layer, create a clipping mask. Let's add some contrast, maybe make it a bit brighter, just like that. Now, what I want to do next is create the illusion that this piece of concrete is actually deeper in the ground and is surrounded by plants. So create a new exposure layer, create a clipping mask. Let's bring the exposure down, slide the offset to somewhere around here. Let's change the gamma to 0.8 or so. Now I want this effect to be applied on the edges only, so let's invert the mask. And for this part, honestly, I think the same fog brush is going to work well. So let's keep that as it is and make sure the opacity is set to 100. Let's scale it down and start painting around the edges right here. If you still don't see much of a difference, try changing your flow up to 100%. And there you go. Now it's working. And as you can see, we're just gonna keep doing this until we have a nice darker shadowy effect. Alright, cool, that looks good. Now remember that we have this massive glowy earth in the background, and naturally a bit of that blue glow is supposed to illuminate the concrete as well. So let's add a hue layer, create a clipping mask, enable colorize. Let's bring the saturation up and change the hue to something closer to that of the planet's glow. And finally change the blend mode to linear light. I think that looks a bit too much, so let's bring the opacity down to 15 or so. Awesome, I think that part is good. So now let's go ahead and work on restoring some of the plants around the edges. And to do that, let's go back to the original field layer, duplicate it by pressing Ctrl J and bring the copy all the way over here. Let's select the layer mask and press Ctrl Delete to reset it. Using this same exact brush or any other one you choose, you can start painting around the edges to make it seem like some of these plants are growing very close to the inside. Now notice that I left the front edge untouched for now, as we're going to deal with that a bit differently in just a minute. Let's go ahead and select the field copy once again, and this time create a new adjustment layer. Let's bring the exposure a bit down, create a clipping mask. Let's invert the mask, and this time using the same brush, start painting around the inside area here. And again, this is all part of creating that depth and height illusion. Next, let's import the armchair image. To mask the chair, let's go to select, subject, and Photoshop will automatically identify the object in this image. Notice that some parts were left out, so you can always use the quick selection tool to add some selection. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect at this stage, so let's go ahead and add the layer mask. I actually want to restore a bit of the shadow that was in the original image here to keep it realistic. And to do that, change to the default brush tool, and with the hardness set to 0%, we can paint around the bottom here to restore that shadow as well as a bit of that reflection on the ground. Now the obvious issue here is that the color and brightness doesn't match the concrete at all. So to fix that, let's first add a new exposure layer, and we're gonna use this one to make the chair look brighter. And of course, remember to create a clipping mask. Let's add another exposure layer right above. This time bring the exposure up. I feel like the top part of the chair is more exposed than it should be, so let's invert the mask, and using the brush tool, let's restore a bit of that exposure towards the bottom half only. I think the exposure is fine. I just want to tweak the color a little bit. As you can see, the ground still looks yellow, so let's add a new hue and saturation adjustment layer. This time let's change from mustard to yellows, bring the saturation down and the brightness up. Maybe I'll switch over to greens as well and change the hue, desaturate this. Alright, great. I think this looks good enough as it is. And keeping in mind that there's all this blue glow in the background, we want to add a bit of that on the edges of the chair. So let's create another hue layer, create a clipping mask. Let's enable colorize, change the hue to blue. Maybe I'll bring the saturation up a bit as well as the brightness. Change the blend mode to linear light. Maybe we can brighten this up a bit more. Alright, let's invert the mask, and using the brush, you can just start painting on the edges to create the highlights. The cool thing here is that you can always go back to your hue properties and adjust the color as you wish. Let me make that slightly brighter. Let's see, before, after, perfect, looks really good. The next thing I want to do is create a new exposure layer, which I will use to darken this area a bit, since it's not exposed to as much light as the top part. Maybe decrease the exposure a bit. Cool. Now that the chair is ready for someone to sit on, let's bring my image in, which I already took specifically for this. If you guys are following this tutorial, you want to do something a bit different, you can use your own image or any other picture you find online. And once again, for this, I'm going to use the magical select subject tool. Now, before moving any further, you want to make sure that the subject is scaled properly. Let's move it down here. And once you're happy with the position, you can use the brush tool to make the right armrest of the chair appear and cover the subject. Alright, I think that fits just right. So now let's add a new exposure layer. Let's bring this below the subject and bring the exposure down, invert the mask. And I'm gonna use this to add a bit of shadow on the inner areas of the chair. You can always adjust the opacity to make sure that the shadow is darker closer to the contact areas and is lighter as we move further from that. In the next stage, I will work on color grading the image to match it to the environment using multiple adjustment layers like usual. And another thing that is still missing here is the highlights on the edges. So let's go and create another hue and saturation layer. The concept is pretty much the same as the one we applied on the armchair earlier. So I'm probably gonna skip or speed this part up in the edit, as I'm confident that you guys are ready to replicate it on your own. I really love using highlights to blend different elements together, so make sure you implement that in your project, as it makes a huge difference. I think we can add a bit more shadows and darkness to these areas inside the chair here. So let's add another exposure layer, create a clipping mask. Let's bring this down, invert, and using the brush, just paint around this area to darken it. Let's see the difference. This is before and this is after. Alright, looks much better. Now remember earlier when painting around the edges of the concrete, we left the front part. So let's go back and fix that. Scroll down to the original field image. Let's duplicate that and bring the copy all the way towards the top. Let's get rid of the current mask, and this time let's switch over to the brush tool and select this grass brush. I actually found this brush online for free, and I'll leave a link down below for you guys to get it. Let's scale the brush down and simply start adding more plants. Maybe we'll adjust the opacity back to 100. There you go. You can just start restoring plants. You can randomize this and overlap your clicks so you can get a more natural and convincing look. Now that makes it look like the plants are growing higher than the ground here, which adds a bit more depth to it. I think it looks really good. So at this stage, what we can do is add a bit of color grading, and this is all up to your creative direction, guys. You can always follow my settings if you want to get the same look. So here we go. First of all, let's add a new curves layer. Let's add a subtle S curve there to bump up the contrast. I want to adjust the overall colors as well, so let's add a hue saturation layer. I kind of want to add a bit more blue towards the middle area here, so let's enable colorize. Slide the hue somewhere around here. Let's bring the saturation up to see what the color looks like. I think this is perfect. Let's invert the mask, revert back to the original brush tool, make it larger. Let's bring the opacity down to 20 or so, and you can start painting to add a blue tint towards the middle. I think that's good enough, and I really prefer to keep it to a minimum. Let's go ahead and add another hue and saturation layer, and this time let's switch over to yellows, as I want to change the color of the field a little bit, desaturate that a bit. Maybe I'll switch over to blues and change the hue to something like this. Bring the saturation up a bit. Let's make things slightly darker. Cool. One last thing I'll always do is add a vignette effect, which brings more dimension to the whole image. So let's add another curves layer, and this time you want to bring the curve down to add a bit of darkness to the overall image. Invert the mask, and again using the same brush tool, just restore a bit of that darkness effect around the edges to create the vignette. Alright, and with that we come to the end of this tutorial. I really hope you guys learned something new and enjoyed this video. Do let me know in the comments below if you have any questions. I promise more content like this one, so don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell buttons to get notified with each upload, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!